Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. As the election winds down and many of us think about how we will mark our ballots come Election Day, I've fielded many questions from friends, family, and even some of you, our viewers, about our democratic voting process. Some of you have asked questions about how voting works. What does the ballot look like? Is it paper or electronic? What about the mail-in ballots? Are those safe and secure? Is that a new method of voting? And who can actually vote? Some of you have asked questions about the security of the process. How do we know the winner is the real winner? And what the voting and tabulation process will look like? And perhaps the most frequent question I field is, does Canada use Dominion voting system to count ballots? Well, these are all fair and reasonable questions. And joining me now to help us explain the election and understand it and its related processes is elections lawyer and university lecturer Mike Donison, who is also a former executive director of the Conservative Party of Canada and former senior policy advisor for legislation and democratic reform to the government House leader. Thank you for joining me, Mike. I'm really looking forward to this discussion because we have so many questions out there that we need to have answered.
I'm glad to be on your show, Tanya. Thanks for inviting me.
No problem. Okay, so I think we should just start with an overarching question. Could you explain a little bit of Canada's tradition of democratic elections?
Well, of course, we'd have to go back to a lot of history. Just one fact I'm going to give you. In terms of Canada, the first quote-unquote democratic elected representative assembly was in Nova Scotia in 1758. Now, there's a long history through that, through Confederation and so on. And what the history is an evolution of more and more democratization. In other words, and we can talk about that in terms of the franchise, which is just a fancy word for who gets to vote, who's eligible to vote. And so that democratic tradition actually goes back when we were still a British Crown colony. Okay, so
this is not new here in Canada. We have centuries to back us up.
Yes, and we have the English tradition of voting. But the difference, of course, then, just to give you an example, in 1758, I'm oversimplifying, it varied from colony to colony. But of course, only men, 21 years of age, who were British subjects and owned property of a certain value, were eligible to vote.
Okay, so when did the voting age change to 18?
Oh, the voting age changed to 18 after the 1968 election, around 1970, when Pierre Trudeau was prime minister.
Right.
It was 21 up to then, and it was reduced to 18. So the 1972 federal election was the first time 18-year-olds were allowed to vote.
Oh, wow. And now sometimes on occasion you hear talk about allowing 16-year-olds to vote and reducing it even further.
Yes, we have had discussion. There's already a provision on the Canada Elections Act where anybody who's 14 years of age or older in anticipation of the next election can register as an early elector with Elections Canada and there's a procedure for that so that they make sure they're on the voters list, if there's elections 4 years hence, right? We don't know whether it'll be 4 years or not. But no, at the moment, it's still 18.
18. And I think it's, again, a little bit to give some information to our viewers, is when did women receive the franchise?
Well, actually, there was some voting for women as early as the 1880s. But in terms of universal voting, it was really in 1920 when all women, it was similar to men, when any woman 21 years of age or older, there were some property requirements, not many, got the vote. But interestingly, in the wartime election, the First World War, for instance, the Conservative government under Borden gave certain women the vote. Spouses, sisters, mothers of combatants, like soldiers, they were allowed to vote. Now, there's some argument that was politically motivated because they'd probably vote for the Conservative government at the time, and there's some truth to that. But in 1920, basically, there was equality for men and women basically by 1920. Yeah.
Okay, and then again, was voting more like the reason that men were voting was it because, for historical context, they were seen as the head of the household, one vote per household, that voice was the voice for the household?
Yeah, I think that was part of the society. It's interesting, there wasn't in many places, there wasn't a prohibition on voting for women.
Okay.
The law was just silent. They just assumed that women shouldn't have the vote. And there was actually an incident in Lower Canada, which was the old Quebec, in the 1830s, where Louis Papineau, you may remember him, he was for female voting back in 1838. And they allowed some women to vote in some polling stations. In those days, of course, it wasn't secret ballot. And there was all kinds of violence, and they decided it wouldn't be a good idea. It was very chauvinistic. It wasn't a good idea for women to vote. So that So there was a little bit of that going on, but that was scrapped. And it wasn't really until 1880s and then later 1920 that women got the vote.
We're going to continue this discussion right when we return. Welcome back. We're discussing the upcoming election and what voting process looks like and why that is so important to our democracy. And joining me again is Mike Donison. Mike, before the commercial, I kind of pushed through the statement, but I was making a comment, an observation that, you know, you had mentioned that there was some violence erupting in some early polling stations in the 1830s. And, you know, lately the headlines have been dominated in Canada about, you know, the egg that was thrown at Maxime Bernier, or the pebbles or the rocks that have been thrown at Justin Trudeau. And it seems so violent, but, you know, perhaps this isn't something new.
Well, to be fair, since then, our elections have been pretty contested, pretty gentlemanly, as they used to say, without much violence. In those days, though, a point I wanted to make, until 1874, you see, there wasn't a secret ballot. People had to actually turn up a polling station and in front of all their neighbors, say who they're voting for.
Just out loud, just vocally out loud.
Out loud. Yeah,
wow.
So it wasn't secret. So there was an awful lot of pressure could be exercised. And sometimes people would show up at polling stations. Oh, yeah, there used to be situations, they used to manipulate. A returning officer who favored it, maybe the government candidate, would say the polls open in a riding, say in a rural riding in an obscure little town, which meant everybody had to try to get there. And he'd only wait an hour. And if after an hour nobody else showed up at the poll, he'd close the poll and award the election to the candidate.
I didn't know this was in our history. I always hear about election shenanigans. I've worked on many campaigns, and I always hear, and I've actually been an election scrutineer, and we'll talk about that in a moment, and we'll talk about that. That's one of my favorite things to do on election day. But, you know, who knew that those shenanigans existed, you know, a couple hundred years ago even?
Now, to be fair, our history, our record is pretty good in Canada, right? Especially since the secret ballot was introduced in 1874, that, you know, federal elections and most provincial elections, they've been pretty civilized exercises. Canada is known as a pretty civilized country when it comes to elections.
And when did Indigenous Canadians receive the franchise?
Well, it's interesting. Actually, that's right. Aboriginals were not entitled to vote. But if you gave up your Indian status, you could get a vote.
If you gave it up?
Yes.
Oh.
And if you served in military. So Aboriginals who served in the First and Second World War, if you served, most of them were men, male Aboriginals, but they got the vote. But it wasn't until 1960 when John Diefenbaker promised, and he gave the universal vote to all Aboriginals. The Indians were given the vote. The Inuit were given in 1950, interesting enough, and Métis were never denied. That's how Louis Riel got elected. The Métis were allowed to vote because they weren't regarded as Indians.
Wow.
Right? At that time, we didn't use the term Aboriginal, you know, in those days. So there's been a gradual, but as of 1960, all Aboriginal Canadians, for sure, had the same requirement. It was then 21, you know, and be a Canadian citizen was
right.
And then you got the vote.
Okay, now let's talk about the actual ballots, because I mean we're going to be faced with ballots in a few weeks, or in a few days. Actually, we're getting really close. What can people expect? Will there be a paper ballot?
The simple answer is absolutely yes, Tanya. There is no other provision. We can go through the methods of voting, including mail voting, but it is a written ballot and you write on it, and it is hand counted. We do not have electronic counting of the ballots in Canada, and I hope we never do. We do not have online voting, and I'm going to be editorializing. I hope we never do. So at the moment, it's a manual ballot. I believe there is some a situation where advanced poll votes sometimes get counted a little bit in advance and they go through the machine. The machine just records the count, but it's all initially manually counted.
Right. And that's, again, I've been a scrutineer many times, and it's an arduous process. But to me, I directly see democracy in action. I know how many votes came in because I've seen them with my eyes, and I've counted them all as an observer for a candidate or as an observer for a party. And I know that every ballot is unfolded in front of me, and it tabulates accurately by the end of the poll closing. Yes,
basically, scrutineers, agents for the candidates, are entitled to watch the process. I always used to complain, though, I've done this before you have, that sometimes they didn't give us enough scrutineers. Like sometimes you'd have to look at 2 or 3 tables.
Yeah, it's crazy.
And sometimes you couldn't see every ballot, you know. But I think the history of it, I would say our system's basically integral.
Yes.
I think now they're human beings, and there can be mistakes made, but generally speaking, I think it's pretty good.
So folks watching, when you go to your polling station to vote on election day or in the advance polls, you will receive a paper ballot. It is not an electronic ballot. It's not a touch screen. It's not remember the good old Chad punching system? It's a paper ballot. I believe you mark an X or something of that. They'll give you the directions. So don't be confused. There's not going to be, it is in a paper ballot, which to me is the cleanest way and to run an election. You see paper in, paper out. It's very simple.
That's right.
Okay, I'm going to pause you there. We're going to pick up this right after the commercial break. Welcome back. We're discussing the upcoming election and what your ballot will look like and how democracy works on election day. And joining me is Mike Donison. Mike, again, thank you so much for being here and for confirming that we will receive a paper ballot on election day. That's exciting to know that.
Yes, the one exception to where you said marking an X, and I'll talk about this, you can have a procedure where you can vote early in the office of the returning officer, and if that's before nominations close and printed ballots, you actually have to write in the name of the candidate. That was earlier on. You still get a printed ballot, it goes into an envelope, and you have to show ID, but you actually have to write the name of the candidate or the party. But as of now, the ballots are all printed now, so any voting will be with the names of the candidates on the ballot and your instructions as to how to mark your 1X.
Okay, so walk us through the process. So I am a registered voter. I've received my voting card in the mail that says this is where you're going to vote. These are the hours. Here are the advance polls. I take it to to my polling station on election day. What do I need to bring? Do I need to bring ID?
Yes. Basically, if you're on the voters list, you should receive by no later than this Friday in the mail from Elections Canada a vote at card. And it will tell you where your polling station is on polling day, but it'll also give you the advance polls because you're allowed to vote in advance polls starting this Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, 9 to 9 as well.
And who is allowed to vote? So say I'm not on the voters list. Say I did not receive this card. Can just anybody show up to vote? Do I need to bring ID? Who is permitted to vote? A lot of questions there.
At all these voting events, whether you're voting in the office of the returning officer, or advance polls, or on polling day, if it turns out you're not on the list, you can register. Again, you have to show adequate ID. There's a test for that.
And what ID? Is just like a driver's license?
Well, the best one is a government-issued piece of ID that has your picture, your name, and the address that you say you live at to show that it's an address in that poll. Or if you don't have, so driver's license is the best by far. But on the other hand, you can have any other two documents as long as across them your name and the address. So, for instance, you could have a library card with your name on it and a an Ontario Hydro bill. And if it shows the address that you're claiming you live, that's good enough.
Okay, we're a national audience, so BC Hydro's okay.
Okay, all right. Okay.
So something with your photo, something with your address and something with your name.
Well, a government-issued ID that has your picture, one piece.
Right.
Now, one piece that has your picture, your name, and your address, that's sufficient.
And who is eligible to vote in Canadian federal elections?
Okay. Basically now, if you are a Canadian citizen and you're 18 years of age on polling day, that is, you achieve the age of 18 as of September 20th, anywhere in the world, Tanya, I'm emphasizing that.
Okay.
You don't have to be resident in Canada. You can be anywhere abroad. And there was a recent amendment up to about 3 years ago. There was a requirement if you're living abroad, if you left your residence, you're living up to 5 years with the intention, you could register and get a special ballot and vote from abroad. This government decided to put through legislation to expand it to anybody. And the David Frum, for instance, famous David Frum, appeared before the Senate committee. I was working in the Senate at the time. And he challenged senators. He said, do you realize, senators, there's 300,000 citizens living in Hong Kong?
Yes.
Those 300,000, if they have to show ID, they have to, but they can, there is, and that's difficult. You have to register and you got to mail, you got to be mailed to you, you got to get it.
It's a process.
It's a process, but conceivably any Canadian citizen now, 18 years of age on polling day, anywhere in the world has a ballot now. So
that's a huge chunk of the electorate if you think about how many Canadians live abroad.
Yeah, but the question is whether, like previously, you could register for at least up to 5 years, but very few used to exercise that. It was a very small number of people. It'll be interesting to see with this expanded thing if that increases the number of votes cast. It's a special ballot. It has to be mailed to you.
Right.
You've got to fill it out, and it has to arrive either at the returning office of the riding you've chosen or the Elections Canada by next Tuesday at 6:00.
Oh, wow. So you've had to kind of get your ducks in a row.
No, I'm wrong. You have to apply by next Tuesday. I'll get into that in a minute. It has to arrive on polling day.
It has to arrive on polling day. Okay.
Yes.
Wow, in Ottawa.
And the Canada Election Act makes it very clear. It is the voter's responsibility, not Elections Canada, not Canada Post, that the ballot is delivered by the deadline.
Okay, so there's a lot to talk about here. And one thing I do want to get into, and we're going to cut to a commercial break in just a moment, but people want to know about this mail-in ballot voting.
Yes.
And obviously, by the time this episode airs, that deadline to apply for it would have been passed. But people want to know, what is going to happen with mail-in ballots? How is that going to impact, perhaps skew the election? Not just for those living in abroad, but the Canadians right here, perhaps some people who have concerns of COVID and walking in to a polling station. Do you need a mask to go into a polling station? All those things we're going to discuss right after this commercial break. Welcome back. Do you have questions about what voting will look like on Election Day? Well, we're here to explain it all, and joining me now is Mike Donison. Mike, mail-in ballots. This is a thing. It was a big thing in the U.S. election. It seems to spilled over here in terms of the curiosity about these mail-in ballots. How does that process work? Is it open to fraud?
Well, first of all, we've had mail-in ballots for about 20 or 25 years. There's been no changes in that. There was some attempts the last Parliament, the Liberal government tried to expand it a little bit, but the bill never got through the Senate. So there's nothing new about mail-in ballots in Canada. Chief Electoral Officer estimates in the last election only about 50 to 75,000 were cast that way.
Oh, wow.
But he's estimating up to 5 million may be cast that way. So he's directed all returning officers, unlike normal elections, they will not even be counting the mail-in ballots, Tanya, until the Tuesday or the Wednesday morning after election night.
Wow.
And if we've got a lot of close ridings and a lot of mail-in ballots, we may not know. It may take and Elections Canada, Chief Electoral Officer said it may take up to 5 or 6 days for returning officers to finally, sort out the mail-in ballots for their riding and add them to the regular ballots.
And if they're up to 5 million potentially expected, I mean, we'll know soon, because the cutoff for the mail-in ballot application will have passed, and then you'll know exactly with what you're dealing.
Now, I don't know if Elections Canada is going to give us those numbers, but that's their estimate.
I want those numbers.
Up to 5 million. Well, is it in the media? You should insist on getting it.
So because that could really skew 5 million. That's a huge chunk of our electorate. So we'll have to see. I mean, again, I'm thinking to the United States, are we going to be, you said days, we're not going to be waiting weeks now to find out who or what kind of government we have, who our local MP is?
Well, I think there could potentially be some delay in some ridings. I mean, some ridings are obvious. The mail-in ballots aren't going to make a difference, right? But there may be some close 20 or 30, up to 20, 30 ridings could be very, very close. And if there's a lot of mail-in ballots, it may take a few days.
Okay.
We may not know the final results in those ridings. But I should say something about it. There's quite a bit of integrity in the process. And remember, to mail-in ballot, you have to apply. It's not like in the United States where voters were just sent the ballots.
Right.
You have to apply. You can apply to Elections Canada or to any returning office anywhere in Canada, but you must deliver your application by 6 p.m. next Tuesday.
Okay.
If you don't, then it's too late. And then you must then get them delivered to you and mail it back in and so on, and by polling day. So it's a tough window. And I suspect a lot of Canadians are going to be surprised when maybe they're too late. And if you miss the mail-in ballot, then you miss the advance polls by that point, right, next week,
right,
then all you're left with is you'd have to show up on polling day at the polling station to vote.
And okay, a question, because I want to talk about foreign interference, but on Election Day, are you required to wear a mask if you have a medical exemption or any kind of exemption? Do you have to show it? What are the rules for COVID?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. The bill that was being brought in was to deal with COVID, and it never became law. But the Elections Canada has the Chief Electoral Officer has the flexibility to adjust the act, right? But I don't think there's legislative basis for mandatory. You can make the election workers mask, because they're under his authority. But my understanding, and I could be corrected on this, I don't think they're going to require. Now, the argument might be that no, the provincial law says when you go into a building,
right,
like a school. So I'm not. It's a very good question, Tanya, and I don't think there's been a clear answer on that.
Well, it's an unprecedented situation. In some parts of the country, they have voted in times of COVID, but we haven't had a federal election in the time of COVID.
This is the first federal election we've had. Yes.
Okay, we only have 45 seconds. Couple things. Foreign interference, are we expecting any? How safe is our democracy from that, foreign interference in elections?
Well, we're expecting now. There were some recent amendments to the Act, very interesting, that specifically made a requirement that no foreign entity at any time can contribute any funds to any election advertising or any election expenses to promote a party or candidate. That's prohibited now. Also, you can't broadcast from outside of Canada either. Even Canadians can't broadcast out. Broadcasting must originate in Canada. Now, it can be broadcasted abroad and then come back, but it's got to originate in Canada.
Okay.
There was also provision about third parties, and I'd love to get into that.
Well, we did actually a whole show on third parties, so if we don't have time because we're running out, that's okay. We did a whole show on this already.
But there's some new restrictions that have been brought in that third parties are not allowed to use foreign sources either for their third party.
Okay, and then to quell any fears of our voters or of our viewers, will Dominion voting systems be used?
No,
okay.
We're not counting ballots by machine.
Okay.
Ballots counted manually.
Okay, well, thank you so much for your time. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but thank you so much, Mike Donison, for your help today.
Thank you, Tanya. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you. When you go to vote and mark your ballots on Election Day, there's one thing that we've learned today, that we can trust the process, there's accuracy in the process, and Canada has a long history of that democratic process. For Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.